Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and this is a video covering the new 1.4 patch that has just come out. This is a massive patch that has changed so much about the game, from a complete overhaul of Cavalry, which now has formations, to balance changes affecting every single nation in the game, and even new things like ranked mode becoming an actual. There's a lot to talk about. But before we do that, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe. That way you don't miss out on any future content I do over Fire Maneuver or even similar games. I always appreciate it, and it is very welcome when you do it. Anyway, let's not waste any more time, and let's just jump right into the big thing, Cavalry Formations. So, hopping right into a quick game, we're going to show off all of the cavalry and their formations. So let's start off with the basic one. Taking a look at the Hussars here, they are in line formation. The biggest change that cavalry has gone is that they no longer have the innate ability to move diagonally. Normally, a cavalry would be able to do something like this, being able to move across multiple diagonals and cover a lot of range. That is no longer the base case. Line formation can only move in adjacent spots in a similar manner to infantry. Now, that is overall a nerf to the mobility of cavalry, but the cavalry in line do get some benefits. The first thing is that they're still able to shoot like cavalry did before, and also their charges have +1 charge damage. This means that it's very similar to that of a attack column. This means that cavalry with charges is even more devastating. This can be very, very powerful with something like a shock cavalry who can be even a harder hitting force. However, if you are looking for maneuverability, then you can look for the march column. March column prevents the unit from attacking. Cavalry and march column cannot shoot and they cannot charge. However, they retain that diagonal movement. So this unit is now able to move diagonally or move in pretty much any way possible. It should also allow you to move even faster on roads, although I don't believe this is working currently. That's only 3 spaces, and I believe that this light cavalry should be able to move 4 because it's in march column on roads, but that might not be working at the moment. And then we have the final formation for light cavalry, and that is dismounted. Dismounted is the shooting formation. It is an open order formation, and unlike the other ones, this formation gives you the greatest angle in terms of shooting, and also it is unique in that this is the only formation for cavalry that is range resistant, meaning that it actually takes less damage when being shot at. However, it is weak to charges, as are pretty much all cavalry formations. It's a very interesting change, and for certain cavalry, this is going to be a formation they're looking to use quite a lot. The most notable ones being skirmish cavalry, as the trait has been reworked to allow for units in open order to move diagonally. This gives them potentially some very sneaky maneuvers, and allows them to do some things that other formations couldn't. We will see how it all plays out, of course, as we play with these units in live. But there's one more thing that needs to be talked about. Heavy cavalry has historically been kind of on the weak side. It's been an overall lackluster unit that basically just was outclassed by the more nimble light cavalry. However, now these guys are potentially very, very powerful because they have access to what is called the echelon formation. Echelon is only available to heavy cavalry, meaning that you have to take them if you want it. But its main benefits are that it is able to move diagonally and can also still charge. This means that heavy cavalry should be able to be a devastatingly nimble unit, almost similar to how they were in previous versions of the game. Whereas light cavalry now has to choose between the powerful charges of line or the maneuverability of the march column. Heavy cavalry kind of get to compromise and get to use the echelon formation in order to get the best of both worlds. On top of that, echelon is also not weak to ranged fire, which is a notable thing, meaning that they take less damage when they're shot at. They're not resistant to it like open order, but they are able to take the standard set of damage. They're not taking bonus damage. So Echelon's a very powerful formation that makes these units very nimble and allows them to be a threat to a lot of different areas on the map. Cavalry with efficiency, which is now something that a lot of cavalry have been given, are also now much more powerful. You can, for example, move cavalry and then have it immediately dismount in order to provide, say, fire cover, using something like fire at will to block off an area. Or you can potentially use it to do something like move up and then quickly swap to line formation, and on the next turn, charge in and deal a ton of damage. There's a lot more thought that's going to have to go into how you play cavalry, and other changes have come to cavalry, making them much easier to fit in compositions, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. But those are the 4 formations for cavalry. I think it's overall, from the few games I've played, very fun to play with this. You have to really consider how you use your cavalry. You can't just randomly send your shock cavalry across the map and then immediately charge into something. If you have to spend a turn getting into line, which is a notable change. And I think overall it just makes cavalry more skillful to use. If you use them correctly, I think that this flexibility is going to be very, very powerful. But if you're just trying to use them blindly and send them into the thick of things, they're going to get destroyed due to that slower mobility and overall just a slower game speed. But regardless, that is the formations. Let's now jump back out of this match and we'll go to talking about some of the universal balance changes. So, there have been quite a bit of changes for the overall units, and we're just going to kind of rattle them off, and that starts out with the cavalry changes. So light cavalry specifically, has gone down 30 points. So Hussars were previously 165 points, they are now 135. Heavy cavalry is now also 10 points cheaper. The cuirassiers were, I believe, about 195 previously, and now they are 175, and they also got another cost reduction from melee drill, which we'll talk about in a second. But these two have overall made cavalry much cheaper, and it's now arguably a lot easier to bring multiple cavalry units in a composition. I should also mention that the new baseline funds in the game is 1,600. That is 400 more than it was previously, meaning that it is also easier to still bring in large amounts of infantry and then maybe fit in a couple cavalry at the end of a composition. So, a lot of builds, pretty much the entire builds in the meta has kind of been shaken up quite drastically due to that. On top of that, as mentioned, melee drill has also gone down 10 points, so now it only costs 20. This means that melee drill is now significantly cheaper than something like shock, which costs, I believe, 30 points compared to the 20 of the melee drill. This means that melee drill, infantry, and cavalry is now much cheaper, and for a small price increase, they're now very good in melee. I think that overall makes melee drill much more worth considering, and also just helps a lot of different nations that often were using melee drill infantry, but didn't want to fully use them all the time because they were just kind of expensive. So that should have changed things. On top of that, shock, I do believe, got a small nerf. It, I believe, went up 5 points in cost, which is a small nerf, but shock is a very powerful trait, so, and to make it a little more different than melee drill, you are paying a little bit more for that upfront damage, where melee drill is maybe not as outright powerful, but it is overall cheaper and still gives you some better power in melee. Then we have the skirmish rework, which was talked about. Open order is able to move diagonally, which allows for some very sneaky things with these light infantry now. There's a lot to try out with this change to skirmish. It costs, I believe, about $20 to purchase with your funds. So the cost for most infantry with that trait have not changed, but their flexibility definitely has. Something like the Voltigears of the Guard are now potentially very, very powerful. Being able to move diagonally to get to the side of an enemy and then laying into them with, say, rifled breechloaders and range drill for tons of damage, all while being in open order, meaning that they take less damage when getting shot at themselves. It's potentially a very interesting trait, and cavalry also having it is very interesting, as I talked about previously, because you have to potentially use these guys as essentially mounted infantry, swapping between moving around in, say, march, and then also dismounting to make use of the skirmish trait. It's a very interesting set of changes that we'll need to see in action. And then the final universal change that has come around is rifled breechloaders have taken a nerf. They have gone up 10 points in their cost. Previously, they were just a combination of rifles and breechloaders, meaning they cost 70. But now, these guns are indeed a bit overtuned. They deal a lot of damage and are easily the thing that if you have them, you take them. So now they have gone up 10 points, and you have a bit of a tax compared to something like a breechloader or rifles. And as such, you are going to have to maybe consider a bit more if you're giving your expensive heavy infantry, or, for example, France will have to decide if it wants to take a bunch of rifled breechloaders because their costs are quite expensive. Before we get into the specific nation changes, I also feel it's worth mentioning that a new DLC has been introduced in the Wars of Unification, which is essentially covering the Franco-Prussian War, alongside adding new maps and also taking the music that was in a small music pack and bundling it in here. It's very similar to that of something such as American Civil War. Although you are not getting new nations to play with, you do get a whole single-player and multiplayer campaign with both the French and Prussians. You're able to join in, and it's its entire single-player campaign. So if you've enjoyed this content from Fire and Maneuver, this could be something that could be right up your alley. So now let's get into the final part of this video that I'm going to be doing, and that is a look at all of the nations that got specific changes to units, and also talking about where I think they stand after the patch. So let's start with France. France has received, I think, overall the most nerfs among the nations in this patch. So talking about their changes, just in a list, the first thing that happened was that Grenadiers of the Guards have gotten shock. This means they have gone up about 30 points, and this is overall both a buff and a nerf. Britain previously had a unit that was exactly the same as this. The Grenadier of the Guards are very, very powerful still, with efficiency, range drill, and a heavy infantry, but you are paying more for that shock, and that's driven their price up to, from what it was previously, I think about 260. They've gone up about 40 points in total. And most of that is thanks to shock and the rifled breechloader nerf. Then we also have a change to Dragoons. Dragoons have been granted efficiency, allowing them to better utilize different formations, because Dragoons historically were essentially mounted infantry. This means that with carbines, these guys can, for example, move and use those new formations, such as being able to dash to a hill and then dismount and then take shots at people before remounting and getting away quickly. And then the final change to a unit is the Carabineers. These guys have also received efficiency, meaning that they are very, very expensive, topping out at almost 300 with breech-loading carbines. However, they are also able to utilize that efficiency to maybe better connect with their shock and melee drill. These guys definitely seem like maybe one of the strongest heavy cavalry out there, being very flexible in what they do, having great stats, and potentially being great for shooting, but they also have the tools to be a very powerful melee cavalry. Alongside things like echelon and the various things for heavy cavalry, these guys could be very, very powerful if utilized correctly, but they are very expensive. I think the most notable thing for France is definitely just that their army has gotten more expensive. Uh, the rifled breechloader changes has driven the price up of pretty much every infantry within their ranks, at least in late period, uh, because one of their biggest strengths is unlimited rifled breechloaders. Combine that with things like Grenadier of the Guards going up in price on top of that, and France is going to have to very carefully consider, does it always want to bring the Universal Grenadier of the Guard when it's costing almost half of your entire funds for these two units? Or would it be better to lean more so on just large amounts of regular line infantry? There are decisions to be made there. On top of that, there are some benefits. Most notably, things like Zouaves have definitely gotten stronger. Only costing 20 more points than that of a standard line infantry means that France should be a little more competent if it gets stuck in large melees. And this also means something like the French Foreign Legion is also gotten cheaper, which makes it potentially a lot easier to fit in as a solid heavy infantry. Also, things like cuirassiers have gone down in cost, so there's a fair amount of French units that have gotten cheaper thanks to the melee drill reduction. Then you also have the light infantry that now all might be a lot more usable. Keeping these units in open order will help to offset their often lower cohesion, and also that diagonal movement allows for some very interesting moves, whether that's dodging enemy charges or doing stuff like preventing or pulling off flanks by moving next to an enemy unit and then laying into their side with open order. Voltigears, I think, are definitely like one of the scariest units with that because they have range drill. Although the chasseurs, Apide, are likely to be an interesting consideration because they are also a little bit cheaper than line infantry. And it may not seem like much, but sometimes saving 10 points off of your build can mean all the difference in what you can afford. So we'll see in how it does. I think France is still overall going to be a very, very strong nation. Like, I just can't imagine that a nation with such a well-rounded roster and just kind of everything it could need is going to end up bad because its units are a little more expensive. But I do think that this will tone their power down a little bit because, in all honesty, France was a nation that I think was, for the amount of effort you needed to put in, it offered too much reward because you just had essentially the best infantry in the game combined with a bunch of line infantry with great weapons, and as long as you didn't make a catastrophic mistake, you could bulldoze people. So I think it's overall fine, but they definitely did take a small nerf. Moving on to Prussia, we're going to talk about probably the most exciting thing, a new unit. Every nation is being brought to have a total of 19 units in its roster, and Prussia was one short. So Prussia is going to receive the Guard Rifles. Guard Rifles are 4 health, 4 cohesion light infantry, and they have range drill, skirmishing, and efficiency. This is potentially very, very powerful. This is the second infantry that the Prussians have that now has efficiency and range drill, meaning that they have potentially a massive increase in their damage if they can get close and use those breech loaders. Combine that with skirmishing, which means that in open order you can diagonally move, and the guard rifles could be a very hard to catch enemy that can deal a lot of damage. However, the changes to cavalry might be enough to keep them in line, as something like a cheap hussar is able to pretty consistently catch the guard rifles when they commit to a melee, and the guard rifles do not have a way to counter it due to the fact that they are able to not form square due to only having 4 health. And they are relatively expensive for this. If these guys die quickly, they are much less durable than something like a foot guard. So there is a real cost. And it might be too expensive compared to taking other things in the Prussian armies. Also worth mentioning, they have a limit of 2, similar to the Grenadier Guards and the Foot Guards. Talking about other changes, Bavarians have received a bit of a rework. They have had their shock exchanged for melee drill. This has overall driven the price of the Bavarians down by essentially 10 points, as previously shock would be 30 points to afford, so they are 10 cheaper than they would be. However, this has kind of been balanced out if you give them the rifled breechloaders, because the breechloaders have gone up by 10. So essentially, for the Bavarians that have the best guns, they have not changed in cost. However, one of their big things is that melee drill is overall a bit more intuitive with their rifled breechloaders. Previously, if you gave them these better guns, then a big thing that would happen is that you would not want to charge into melee with them. But with melee drill being cheaper and also being a passive effect, it makes using something like Bavarians with these RBLs a lot more sensible, and you might see these more in compositions, especially if you're combining them with the new guard rifles and foot guards, and then backing it up with maybe some line infantry. It could be a powerful combination, with the Bavarians serving the useful role of a sturdy line infantry that also just happened to have some of the only rifled guns available to Prussia. The other change is that Grenadier Guards have also gone down in 10 points, so they're now a bit cheaper, which is nice. Then talking about their cavalry, specifically Prussian hussars have gained efficiency. This keeps them at about 160 points, which is relatively. It is definitely closer to what they were in the vanilla or in the previous patch, and they are definitely still a bit less flexible. However, efficiency is potentially very, very powerful, especially if you're willing to give them something like a carbine. Being able to move and then dismount and blast the enemy with breech-loading carbines could be a powerful combination, especially because unlike cavalry, you get that 3 speed, meaning you can do something like form march, move 3 spaces, and then dismount and blast people apart. It could be a very, very powerful combination. We also have had actually, Prussian Dragoons already had efficiency, so they are essentially the same thing. Cuirassiers have dropped down in 10 points, and the Saxon Guard have received a change. They have swapped melee drill for efficiency. This makes them a little worse in melee overall, but it also means that they are potentially more interesting in flexibility. As I've said before, efficiency, unlike the Hussars, allows these units to potentially do pretty devastating shooting. But the guards can potentially be very interesting because they can go from open order blasting at people. They can immediately form something like echelon or line formation and then charge for devastating shock damage. It's potentially a very interesting combination unit, and it might be very flexible once you get used to kind of what they need to be useful. Overall, I would say Prussia definitely won out on this patch. Guard Rifle seems like an extremely powerful unit that could very easily cement itself as a continuously powerful core for British or Prussian armies, especially with the higher funds. Range drill and efficiency has just proven to always be very strong. So I think that's very, very powerful. The cheaper Bavarians and Grenadier Guards is also nice, making them a bit more reasonable to bring in comps. And then their cavalry has gotten a bit more of efficiency around their units, potentially making them better at moving and shooting on the same turn, or just generally being a more proactive threat as long as you're willing to spend orders on them. I think Prussia definitely is just better, but I don't think it is a massive step forward. Their tools have definitely expanded, but outside of the guard rifles, some of this stuff is more complementary rather than like just outright making them significantly stronger. Moving on to Britain, I would say Britain overall is maybe one of the biggest winners out of this patch, and the biggest reason for that is simply that their heavy infantry have gotten buffed. They are cheaper now, and because of that, it is much easier to play Britain. So let's start with the smaller change. The Highlanders have gone down 10 points. Nice little change. Highlanders are a little bit easier to stomach when you want to bring a couple of them in compositions. They're very solid line holders. Melee drill means that they're good in melee, and then they have still the range drill and the heavy infantry stats making them great. But the bigger thing is foot guards. Foot guards have lost shock. Essentially, the French stole their shock for their Grenadier of the Guards. But now foot guards are essentially the best infantry in the game. They are extremely cost effective, costing only 275 points with rifled breech loaders. This makes them so much easier to include in armies, and that is something that Britain had been struggling with for a long time, is that they really wanted to take their foot guards, but their foot guards were costing like almost 300 points, and then they just had no money for anything else. The larger budgets with 1600 funds alongside having cheaper, efficient heavy infantry gives Britain a lot more room to build armies that might actually make sense to play around with. As an example, here is a composition that could be tried out if one wanted. It is also notable that their light infantry with the new skirmish trait have also gained a bit of power. Open order range drill on these light infantry might make them really, really good, and stuff like rifles could also be a very strong consideration if you wanted to do a variety of things and are looking for a variety of different changes. But the big things are definitely the heavy infantry. Now, they have also received some changes to cavalry. Most notably, they have 3 dragoon units, and all of the dragoon units now have efficiency. They are the only, I believe, the only European nation to have an efficient range drill dragoon unit, or light cavalry unit, which gives them potentially a very mobile damage dealer if you're willing to give them the breech loading carbine, making them very hard hitting and very nimble. They also have a more standard dragoon unit, but with range drill, they are more expensive, yet also decent at shooting. And then you also have the dragoon guards, which are kind of the extreme version of this. Having the melee drill and additional stats in order to be pretty good in melee, but also being able to shoot and maneuver very efficiently, albeit at a high cost. Britain, I think, definitely overall did win out on this patch. It can't be emphasized enough that just having a decently sized army is something Britain has struggled with for quite a while. And now they can hopefully afford a decently sized army and not be overran by something like the Ottomans or Russians, who previously were really starting to bully them out of the game, because you brought like 4 units to a match and then you would end up just losing everything because you get stuck in melee and swarmed with a bunch of cheap units. You should hopefully have a stronger set of line forces that are able to hold the enemy back while not compromising on your high quality. So I think Britain is definitely one of the bigger winners out of this patch. Moving on to Russia, this one has received a new unit in Greek volunteers. Now, these are only for the early period, but they cost a measly 45 points, as they are just rugged, disorganized infantry with 4 health and 3 cohesion. Very, very weak in terms of its actual combat capabilities, but it also means that Russia now has a rugged infantry in both early period and the late period. Although the Finnish guards are definitely a much harder hitting rugged unit, the Greek volunteers do give you at least something to put in there. And their cheap cost does mean that they could be good in terms of swarming, as they're even cheaper than something like the militia unit. They also have a limit of 2. Then, on top of that, the obvious changes, things like Grenadiers have gone down in 10 points because they had melee drill. You have the Cossacks, which have gotten a bit of a change. Their most notable thing is that instead of skirmishing, which didn't really fit with the new way, the new skirmishing just doesn't fit with what the Cossacks were. So instead, they have been given rugged. This means that Russia now has a rugged cavalry unit also, and this one also has shock, meaning it can hit potentially very, very hard. Beyond that, their dragoons actually did not receive any new perks. This means that they are extremely cheap, but they're also quite weak. But if you give them melee only, they're only 115, which is dirt cheap. Then also their cuirassiers and chevalier guards have both received a small price reduction because of melee drill going down. And overall, that's about it in terms of Russia. Not a lot of changes to them. They're not going to feel massively different. The biggest things are the quality of life changes with just more rugged available in both early period or in general through the Cossacks. Alongside that, they can also bring just way more cavalry now. And they can also potentially do stuff like spam their heavy infantry a little more realistically and still afford other things. Uh, it's overall nice changes to them, but they're not getting anything super standout. They just aren't going to be as bad in rugged, which is a nice thing in order to give them a little bit more flexibility and kind of bring them in line with every other nation that has at least one rugged unit to always use. The Ottomans are a nation that have largely been unchanged by it. None of their infantry got any new changes. They didn't get any new units. The only thing that changed perk-wise was that Cossacks, in a similar thing to the Russians, got rugged, which does give the Ottomans a rugged cavalry, although with Egyptian line infantry, they already had a pretty solid rugged unit to make use of, so it's not as impactful as it is for Russia. Outside of that, some of their units did get a little cheaper. Their Zouaves are a little bit cheaper. And similar to Russia, their Dragoons do not have any additional perks. But this does mean that they are the literally cheapest, one of the cheapest cavalry in the game, bottoming out at a mere 100 points for them, although this is without carbines. So 130 with a carbine. That is very, very cheap for a unit. Overall, the Ottomans probably don't change a whole lot. Naturally, by having 1600 funds, you're able to maybe run a bit more of a quality build, bringing like more Zouaves and Imperial Guards alongside being able to spam your Bashis and other things, and just in general having that. Also, things like skirmishing rifles might be a little more usable, but overall, these the way you play the Ottomans is largely the same, and unless skirmishing proves to be like a very strong build around, you're not going to feel a whole lot of changes from this patch. The Austrian Empire might be one of the nations that has won out in this patch, receiving a lot of different changes that have potentially made them even more flexible and more powerful overall. The first thing to talk about is that they actually have had a unit removed. The volunteer hussars are no longer a unit available within the nation. Those units were not very good anyway, as they were just skirmishing hussars, and those were not very good, so they have been removed. But on the other hand, they have received two late period infantry, the Landwehr and the Hungarian Honved. These are essentially just militia versions of the German line and Hungarian line infantry. They're cheaper, but they retain similar perks. The German Landwehr are essentially trading away some of their stats for... They're essentially just standard militia units, honestly. 6 health, 3 cohesion with breakable. They can stand in as a very cheap version of something like the line infantry if you just need like something to hold a flank or something similar. You also have the Hungarian Honveds, which are essentially just a different version of the line infantry. Now, the Hungarian line infantry are actually able to hold their own in melee a bit because they have 4 health, while the Honved are really only there to charge in and deal that shock damage, because breakable and lower cohesion means they will die rapidly if they get stuck in a prolonged melee. So, bit of a difference here, but obviously a notable price difference. Honveds are 40 points cheaper, than the line infantry with equivalent guns. So maybe a different role, depends on what you're looking for, but definitely something to look to make use of. It is notable that the Hungarian line infantry have gone up in points a little bit because shock went up in price. But we also have another change. The Bavarian line infantry, similar to their Prussian counterparts, have traded away shock for melee drill. This now means that in the early period, at least, the Austro-Hungarians can combine Hungarian line infantry with Bavarians to kind of make a mini Hawk and Durchmeisters, which is an interesting thing to maybe consider using because you get so many units out of it. But their lower price is definitely something to make use of. Now, these units have not received any changes, but the Grenzers, the Feldjägers, and the Kaiserjägers have all been probably buffed quite significantly because skirmishing is very powerful with open order. This is most notable, I think, with Grenzers and Kaiserjägers because these two have pretty good stats with 6 health and 4 cohesion in order to shoot at and engage with the enemy. Being able to move that diagonally prevents them from being charged at, and their higher stats or range drill makes them very powerful in that formation. The Hawks have received pretty much an indifferent change. I believe they've gone down a total of 5 points because they've gone down 10 from melee drill, but up 5 from shock. So they're a little bit cheaper, which is nice. Getting to the cavalry, however, they have also received some bigger overhauls. The Hussars for the Austrians have received melee drill and disorganized, meaning that they're stronger in melee but less powerful if they get shot at, taking longer to regain their cohesion. And then volunteer Uhlans have received rugged instead of skirmishing, since skirmishing did not really make sense with what the volunteer Uhlans did. This makes them very similar to the Cossacks, which is potentially quite powerful. Then you have the Dragoons, who have received skirmishing instead of efficiency, like the other Dragoons we've seen so far. This means that they're better when they're in open order, but they're not as flexible if they need to change formations. But if you can get these guys to a hill and dismount them, they can diagonally move and potentially lay into an enemy unit, or move away from a charging enemy infantry and dodge that charge. So potentially an interesting change, and it's also a little bit cheaper than having efficiency, so they are overall a tad cheaper than their counterparts. Overall, it is notable, one last thing, is that Rifled Breechloaders has overall nerfed most of these units if you wanted to give them Rifled Breechloaders previously. Obviously, stuff like the Kaiserjägers are going to have to pay for that because they really can get a lot of use out of it. But overall, I think Austria has... It's hard to say because so much of Austria has changed. The new militia-style units is very interesting because it gives you some very cheap options for the late period. The Bavarians are now very cheap melee drill for the early period. You have much more powerful things like Grenzers and Kaiserjägers to make use of. The cavalry has been pretty radically altered with things like Hussars being great to bolster a melee. You could potentially have the Hungarian line infantry combining with the Hussars in order to have that melee drill assisting them in combat. And then you also have things like Dragoons that are skirmishing, and overall quite a lot of changes. And I guess we'll have to see in the end. But I do expect that maybe Austria does have a little bit more punch if it really wants to lean into a specific strategy. You know, it could lean very much into like a melee-focused strategy now, with things like the Hussars and Bavarians adding melee drill to compositions, or if they wanted to go a bit more in the range drilled option, or at least open order formations, then they have the tools to maybe try that out also. So they might be able to lean a little bit more into different things, and the wider budget means that they're able to cover their capabilities a little more. It's a little more reasonable to run like Hawks and Kaiserjägers together, and then still do like the standard Hungarian-German line combos that have become pretty standard within Hungarian builds. So, a lot to try out, and a lot of changing to the Austrians. Then we get to the final European nation, the Kingdom of Italy, who has received a new cavalry unit in this one that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. It has 4 health, 3 cohesion, melee drill, and skirmishing. A very interesting perk combination because the new skirmishing encourages shooting, yet you also want to be potentially getting these guys into melee. I could see the argument that maybe these guys are going to be an interesting 1-2 punch where you're able to use these guys for shooting, and then if the enemy tries to grind them down in melee, they'll deal more damage. Or you can move in to assist something like the Bersaglieri, or even something like a Redshirt Zouave. So maybe there's some uses for it. It's a very interesting unit. Close comparisons to, for example, the Carabinieri, who are a little more expensive but do have the more useful rugged trait. Beyond that, we also can talk about the changes to the Dragoons. This is the only unit in the Italian roster that has also received a change. They also have skirmishing, which is interesting because they also have shock. So you want to use them for shooting, but yet you also want to use them for charging. It's kind of like a dual purpose thing, and reminds me very much of the Bersaglieri and how they're going to kind of play now. You potentially have some very interesting options where one could potentially do diagonal charges with these units in open order and still get good damage off of shock. I don't expect that to be like a common strategy, but it is a very interesting one that you could use if the enemy is getting too close or is trying to do something weird to you, because most people probably won't consider that as an option. But if you get charged by a shock, Bursags or Dragoons, and they were shooting at you in open order, and then they charge you, that could be a very frustrating thing to deal with. So, might be an interesting combination. Outside of that, Italy did benefit a small bit from their redshirt Zouaves going down in price point. These guys are a little bit cheaper, which is nice. They also have very cheap cavalry now, which is the most notable thing. Their mounted guides are only 90 points. And although these guys do suck, they are extremely cheap. So there could be some very interesting uses there. But otherwise, yeah, not a whole lot to say about Italy. I don't think Italy will change a whole lot. They'll get some funny uses with things like the Alpi and the Bursags, which are able to just sort of move diagonally in open order and shoot at people, which is an interesting thing. But otherwise, they're not changing a whole lot compared to other nations like Austria. Moving on to the United States of America, they have received a couple brand new that fills out their roster and gives them some very interesting changes. So let's talk about those new units. First off is the Buffalo Soldier, a late period cavalry. It is a light cavalry that has skirmishing and rugged, and then it has 4 health and 4 cohesion. These guys are potentially very interesting. They are now the only rugged unit in America, which is going to be an important thing for them. And with their good stat line of 4 cohesion and skirmishing, they might be able to act as essentially your rugged infantry during a match if that's what you need. But you can also then use them as cavalry. They seem to be a well-rounded inclusion and should be generally worth it. Then we also have the new 12-pounder mountain gun. These are a new artillery type. They are 6 health, 2 cohesion, and 2 range, and then they have currently cumbersome, indirect fire, and rugged. Now, I have to be honest, is that at the current moment, the cumbersome is, I think, making this unit almost worthless. It's just the 2 range is so small. Like, units with rifles are able to shoot at this. It can outrange a rifled infantry. So it has to be like behind your own units, and it just seems like it's going to be a lot of work to make this worthwhile to use. And with cumbersome, it's just going to be so slow. So at the moment, I think this unit is not great. However, if it were to lose something like cumbersome or maybe get some more range, having a rugged artillery piece that can indirect fire and shoot like over a forest hex could be a really interesting unit, especially because it is going to be a very cheap unit. Being able to bombard people and deal a fair amount of damage in that regard. So I think overall, not great right now because of Cumbersome, but if Cumbersome goes away, or that maybe there's some other changes, it could be an interesting variation on the Howitzer. Rugged artillery is something we haven't seen in any nation so far. Then we have a rework to the regular cavalry, who now, instead of being just a 6 health 4 cohesion rugged cavalry, they have range drill and skirmishing. This makes them a premier shooting unit. They're still only late period, but they are going to probably be monstrous in terms of shooting people. They are quite expensive, but being able to dismount and have range drill means that these guys can actually deal some real damage, and the diagonal movement, again, gives them some great flexibility. I think it's a very interesting unit that might be really, really strong. We also have the Lightning Brigade that got a small buff by gaining efficiency. This allows them to be skirmishing and efficient, making them very nimble and hard to catch. This should overall, I think, improve their power a bit and make these guys potentially very, very useful as a quick dash and kill, as they're able to, for example, use March Column to get around the enemy, dismount, shoot at them, and then can move diagonally to safety before the enemy can retaliate. Beyond that, most of their units did not receive a whole lot of changes. The Zouaves for their nation have gotten cheaper, which is a nice thing. Easier to fit these into compositions, pairing them up with something like Irish Brigades, making them potentially an interesting 1-2 punch. You also, again, have maybe the skirmish detachments and sharpshooters are a bit more interesting, being able to move to safety a little bit more consistently. But otherwise, they're not changing a whole lot. But I do expect that the US will start taking a lot more cavalry. This seems like an extremely potent cavalry roster. Just pretty much anything you could want. You got cheap ones, you do have a shock unit, and then you have like rugged, range drilled, efficiency. Like, you have a lot of options when it comes to taking high-powered cavalry. And they're all sporting skirmishing, meaning that they can all fight as essentially dismounted infantry when you need them to. And the final nation we're taking a look at is the Confederate States of America. They have also received 2 new units, the first one being Texas Rangers, who are 4 health, 3 cohesion light cavalry that have shock, skirmishing, and rugged. This makes this unit very, very powerful in terms of being able to essentially act almost like a Russian Cossack with the shock and rugged combination. But they also have skirmishing, meaning they could potentially dismount in that rugged terrain and fight like an infantry, potentially giving them a dual-purpose role. And then, similar to their American counterparts, they have a 12-pounder mountain gun. This is the exact same stats, 6 health, 2 cohesion, 3 range actually on this one. So maybe the other one was not updated, but this might be a little bit more interesting of a tool. Being able to have rugged means these can move through rough terrain a bit better, and overall be a bit more useful in that regard. Their cost is a little bit on the low end, mainly being a little bit more expensive than the Howitzer. But being able to stick these in rugged terrain and not having them bogged down can potentially make it hard for the enemy to deal with them. So this might be an interesting option if you're going into certain maps that are very rugged in their map and terrain area. Other changes are that the regular cavalry have been reworked. The Confederacy regular cavalry has melee drill instead of range drill, but they do also have efficiency and skirmishing. This means these guys can move, dismount, and are able to be decent shooters. They're not as strong as the US regular cavalry, but they're much more nimble in their tools. And they do also have melee drill, so they're a bit more powerful in terms of getting into a melee if they need to. Hampton's Brigade and the other Confederate cavalry has not changed. Then, in terms of their infantry, essentially the Louisiana Tigers went up a couple points. The Stonewall Brigade also went down in a couple points, and I think that's really nice because now they're only about 210 with rifles. This makes Stonewall a little bit easier to fit into compositions, as previously he was on the expensive end in terms of his price. But now he's a little bit cheaper, so that's nice. And then, again, the sharpshooters and detachments, similar to the US, will probably be a little more interesting because they have that ability to move diagonally. The biggest thing is, again, that the cavalry is now looking very powerful. A lot of skirmishing. You have much more shock and a melee-oriented option in terms of the Confederacy compared to that of the United States. The United States definitely seems like it's a bit more of dismounting and shooting, where the Confederacy is more about getting into melee and then having the option to dismount. But I still think that the Confederacy probably does benefit quite a bit from these changes. It's just got more options for that. It's got a lot of rugged cavalry. It can actually bring a pretty ridiculous amount of rugged cavalry if it wants to, which is quite an interesting combination. But otherwise, those are all of the nations. Those are all the changes and my thoughts on them. This update has brought a lot to the game, and I'm personally very excited to play out with this, especially again because there is a new ranked match where you're able to compete and try stuff out. But otherwise, that is mostly it for today. The only other thing I want to mention at the end of this video is that there is currently currently a Prussian Franco War event that is going on in the Fire and Maneuver community. You can find it by going to the main Fire and Maneuver Discord. You can find a link down in the description below. But otherwise, that is all I have for you today. So if you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out on any future content. And otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.